Last week, as you know, I was on leave, and Bariana and I had a great time up in the Hunter Valley. But sadly, during one of those days, I also tore my calf. Oh, yeah, that's why I'm sitting down. Actually, it's improved. I've seen the physio, so it's improved. And it's fortunately only a small tear, but about 2 or 3 weeks to heal up. So standing is not good for me. That's why we're doing this. Anyway, today we're going to see the second part of the crucifixion of Jesus from Luke 23. And we're going to start the reading at verse 44. I must really be thankful to God that we've got such great health care in this country and how this is going to heal up. This is nothing to talk about when Jesus can do this on the cross for us. Verse 44, Now it was about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, for the sun stopped shining. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Jesus called out with a loud voice, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. When he had said this, he breathed his last. The centurion, seeing what happened, praised God and said, Surely this was a righteous man. When all the people who had gathered to witness this sight saw what took place, they beat their breasts and went away. But those who knew him, including women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching these things. Now there was a man named Joseph, a member of the council, a good and upright man, who had not consented to the decision and action. He came from the Judean town of Arimathea, and he himself was waiting for the kingdom of God. Going to Pilate, he asked for Jesus' body. Then he took it down, wrapped it in a linen cloth, and placed it in a tomb cut in the rock, one in which no one had yet been laid. It was preparation day, and the Sabbath was about to begin. The women who had come with Jesus from Galilee followed Joseph and saw the tomb and how his body was laid in it. Then they went home and prepared spices and perfumes, but they rested on the Sabbath in obedience to the commandment. As we read this account of the end of Jesus' crucifixion and his burial, we really need to read this thinking, what's Luke trying to achieve here? After all, there are 3 other gospel accounts of Jesus' death and burial, and most of them have roughly the same details. So for Luke to write this particular one, he must have special reasons. Now, I think one of the reasons is that Luke is trying to show that the death of Jesus is a historical fact. It really happened. There are lots of people around who say, oh, maybe it never happened. Then we don't have to worry about him rising from the dead. That's a myth too. And we don't have to worship him. We don't have to pay attention to anything he says. But he's saying, Luke's making a point here, that this really happened because we can count the witnesses. There was just so many witnesses. The witnesses at his... Here we go. The witnesses we have are a bit of a crowd around the cross. And there are all kinds of witnesses there. In the account from Luke, we know that his enemies were some of the witnesses. There were people from the high priest who were mocking him. They would ridicule him. There were others in the crowd who were shouting things at him. One of the criminals was mocking him. Enemies of Christ were there. And they were there to make sure he really died, because these are the people who wanted to kill him. It was in their personal interest to make sure he was dead. You can imagine that if somehow Jesus just fainted and wasn't really quite dead, there would be an outcry from the people who wanted to have him crucified. They would not stop there. That was important. They wanted him dead. Who else was there? Well, we know that the Romans were there. They were responsible for carrying out the crucifixion. It's their duty to make sure he dies. It's like, for example, we have still have execution in some parts of the world. And if the executioner takes a prisoner away and says, oh, well, I mucked it up, he's not really dead, most executioners would be in a lot of trouble. So the Romans were there to make sure he was dead. The other Gospels give us details about this. In John 19, for example, it says that the Jews asked for Jesus' legs to be broken, and also of the other criminals on the other 2 crosses. And it says that the soldiers went around and examined the other 2. They broke the legs of the 2 criminals, but when they came to Jesus, they didn't break his legs because he was already dead. He died in a way that convinced the Roman soldiers he was not alive anymore. And if they were just not convinced of that, then one of the soldiers ran up with a spear and stabbed him in the side, and all his blood came out. So by this time, surely he's dead. How much more evidence do we need? The Romans also said one special thing. In verse 47, the centurion, seeing what happened, praised God and said, surely this was a righteous man. The word is righteous or innocent. It's slightly different in the other Gospels where it says this man was the Son of God, but the idea is the same. He didn't do anything deserving an execution. He was innocent and righteous. The way he carried himself through the trial, through the crucifixion, the way he was actually comforting others and offering mercy to other people. This was a man who was innocent and righteous. Well, apart from the enemies and the Romans, there was a large crowd of people there. Back in verse 35 it says, the people were there and they were watching, because this was, well, Friday afternoon entertainment. In a time when there was no internet and no TV, you can't get your iPhone out, what would people do? They would look for spectacles that they could pass a few hours of the day. You can imagine, even as late as the late 19th century when executions were common, one of the reasons executions were eventually banned was because they turned into a little carnival. People would bring their picnic baskets along, spread out the road, spend a few hours out there waiting for the hanging to happen, or it would be the firing squad or something like that. And the government officials were thinking, this is getting a bit macabre. This is not what it's meant to be. An execution is supposed to warn people not to commit crime, not to invite them out for a good day. But people were there. And I think that should we ever go back to public executions again, the same sort of thing would happen. People would come out, they wouldn't be frightened anymore, and we'd have our picnic baskets out there and have little parties, and people would be toasting and drinking and making merry of something that's actually very, very serious. Well, the crowd didn't stay happy for too long. In verse 48, it says, when all the people who had gathered to witness the sight saw what took place, they beat their breasts and went away. They saw the whole thing. They saw an innocent man being destroyed. They saw injustice of their world system and their government, their own leaders persecuting someone who had done nothing wrong. And they might have been even convicted of their own part in this. Some of the crowd would have been among those who were calling for the crucifixion, and they suddenly realized, I've done the wrong thing. Some of them would be just there watching the spectacle and realize, I didn't do anything to stop it. Some of them may have even realized, this might really be the Son of God, and I'm guilty in God's sight. Just the sins that we have done. The crowds were there. And they went away. Beating their breasts is a sign of deep mourning. He had died, otherwise they wouldn't be doing that. The last group that we got of the witnesses, of course, are his friends. Jesus' friends were there. In verse 49 it says, all those who knew him, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching these things. Now, they were standing at a distance because, well, there's a big crowd around, but it's also dangerous to get too close to Jesus. Peter found that out. He was trying to do something heroic and brave, and suddenly people recognized him and said, you're a Galilean. We can tell by your accent, the way you dress. You just don't look like a Jerusalem person. And he was frightened because he might get arrested. He might get beaten up. Perhaps he might get crucified. So his loyal supporters, his disciples, were standing around there, but at a distance. They were watching all these things, and they witnessed it. With all these witnesses, we can be fairly sure that Jesus was executed and died. There is a fellow called John Dominic Crossan, who is known among New Testament academics. The guy is an atheist, but he does study the New Testament for historic and archaeological reasons. And this is what he has to say about it. Jesus' death by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate is as sure as anything historical can ever be. Atheists are good for something. If an atheist will say that, we can be fairly sure that Jesus died. What he says about the resurrection, of course, he thinks that's a myth, but that's another story. But for him to say this, we can be fairly sure from all the evidence that we have, there was a person called Jesus who was nailed to a cross and who died on that day. So we have all these witnesses. And then the second thing we have to think about is, what did they witness? Okay, time for a science lesson, I think. I like science. So, what's this? What is it? Eclipse. What kind of eclipse? A solar eclipse. What kind of solar eclipse? Total solar eclipse. Are they common or rare? Rare. How rare are they? One every few hundred years. You know there's a solar eclipse roughly every 18 months, somewhere on Earth. Total solar eclipse. There's plenty of partial eclipses. They're quite common. A partial eclipse will happen nearly every full moon somewhere on Earth, but a total solar eclipse only happens roughly twice every 3 years, on average. What makes us think they're rare is for a solar eclipse to happen in the same place is roughly once every 400 years. So if we have a solar eclipse over Sydney tomorrow, and we all go, oh, that's wonderful, don't hold your breath for the next one. It'll probably be your great-great-grandchildren who might have children who see that. It's a long time to be at the one place. Okay, second one. How do solar eclipses occur? Thinking. Somebody did this in high school, I'm sure. How did solar eclipses occur? Yeah, Alice is doing the right thing there. She's been to high school class. She's just paying attention. It looks something like this. I'm sure some science teachers have done this for us. Some of you will remember this. Some of you were asleep that day. So a solar eclipse happens when the moon casts a shadow on the Earth. So the sun's light is blocked out. This is obviously not to scale, but what you end up with is this little area, which is roughly about 70 or 80 kilometers across, depending on how far or near the moon is. A solar eclipse cannot happen at full moon. Okay? Because in a full moon, the moon is around this side. It's on the far side of the Earth. That's why the sun's light bounces off the moon and comes back to Earth, and you see the full moon. Full moon happens every month. Passover is a full moon festival. So whatever else you want to say about the sun getting blocked out on that crucifixion day, it wasn't a solar eclipse. Actually, I should show you this picture. This is a to-scale diagram of what the sun and Earth and moon look like. The only thing that's not to scale is how far the sun is from the Earth and the moon. This should be 12 meters that way. Okay? The sun is actually very far from the Earth. The moon, if you see this, is in this diagram, the moon is 1 pixel in diameter, just there. And the Earth will be about 4 pixels in diameter. The point about this is that there's a lot of sun that can cast a lot of rays to bounce backwards and forwards over here. So we can see the moon at full moon, even though it's around the back of the Earth. But in a total eclipse, it's actually quite rare. So why do some people think, if you read some commentaries, they say, oh, it might be a total eclipse. That's why it went dark. Just a warning for young players. Don't read back into Greek what we use now. The word that Luke uses for the sun being darkened, the sunlight actually failed. He uses a Greek word called eklippo. So some modern scholars think, oh, that's an eclipse. Well, it's actually not. Eklippo means to fail or to cease. It's not an astronomical term. It just means that on that day, not a total eclipse, sunlight failed. Okay. Now, the second thing we've got to think about here in verse 44, it says, "It was about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3, for the sun failed, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two." Back in verse 44, we have to think about how far did this darkness go? If you look in your English translations in verse 44, it will say that the darkness came over the whole land, or something like that. Okay, but the question is, how big's the whole land? Because the very same word in Greek is the same word as earth. So did Luke mean the sunlight was blocked out over the whole land or over the whole earth? So lots of different people think about this and say, oh, well, over the whole land means just over Jerusalem. Or it means just over Judea. Or it just means just over the Middle East. And hardly anyone will say over the whole earth. But you have to think about, why did the sun's light fail? What was going on for 3 hours? To come to a good answer for that. Right. Someone should run around with a mic. Okay? The question here is, why did the sun's light fail when Jesus was on the cross? Anyone?
Well, that's right to know.
That's fair enough. You could pass it on. I should ask Osmond to pick someone.
Oh, okay.
You did? Tim?
Because God made it so.
Yeah, why? Actually, that's an extremely good answer. We've never thought of. Who's never thought about this before?
Me.
Who's never? Why did the sun's light fail when Jesus was on the cross? What was
Because
going
God is
on?
not happy.
Anyone else? God's not happy is probably true. What?
Oh, she knows?
She said something.
Oh, okay.
I said it's because Jesus is the light of the world,
And so what?
and he died.
But he didn't die. He wasn't dead yet.
He.
So this is from about noon to about 3. It was dark. Okay? So what happened? Why did Jesus die? Why was he on the cross? Because of sin. We believe that when Jesus had to die for the sin of the world, right? When he was on the cross, we believe that God placed on him the sin of all the earth, of everyone from all time. And such a serious thing happened here, where the Son of God, who is perfect, holy, and innocent, as all these witnesses have said, suddenly has all our filth on him. It's such a creation-shaking event that the sun's light failed. Now, if we go back and say there was a darkness over Jerusalem, that would be implying Jesus only died for the sins of Jerusalem. Or if it was dark over Israel, Jesus only died for the sins of Israel. But the Bible tells us clearly Jesus died for the sins of the whole world. Why should not all the earth be in darkness? The sun's light failed. I think personally that for the vast majority of New Testament scholars, their God is too small. All right, don't do that. This is a big God. He did something so big that the universe had to respond. It's powerful. And it's also a fulfillment of promises. There are 2 references in the Old Testament to this. In Amos 8, it says, "In that day declares the sovereign Lord, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight," which is exactly what happened. He says in verse 10, I will turn your religious festivals into mourning, all your singing into weeping. I will make you wear sackcloth and shave your heads. I will make that time like mourning for an only son, like the end of a bitter day. And it was. This is God's promise from Amos about 8 centuries before it happened. Another one from Joel. The sun will be turned to darkness, the moon into blood, before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. For on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem there will be deliverance, as the Lord has said, even among the survivors whom the Lord calls. It's about the day of the Lord. The sun went dark because this is God's day about to happen. First judgment and then victory. What else did these people witness? Something cosmic that says God's day is coming. They witnessed a man of mercy. God showing his mercy to people all around him. Verse 34, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. That includes us. Verse 43, today you'll be with me in paradise. Actually, that's not right. The punctuation in our translations is probably incorrect, because we end up with saying, Jesus said, truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. The comma is probably placed correctly after the word today. I'll read that with new punctuation. Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise, which gets rid of all kinds of problems about where did Jesus go after he died on the cross, and where was the criminal and all that sort of stuff. Jesus is making a promise about that day. Mercy is what they witnessed. Mercy from an executed, dying man. Verse 46, Jesus called out with a loud voice, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And when he had said this, he breathed his last. How do crucifixions kill people? You suffocate. That's true. You have been paying attention. If you ever tried doing this for too long, your arms get tired. But imagine if your arms don't get tired because you've been strung up. Right? Your feet actually can't touch the ground. Some people who are doing weights and work in the gym may do this. If you try and do a chin-up too long, your arms burn and you say, let's stop. Because if you keep hanging up there, you stop breathing. This is a very important part of breathing and how your breathing muscles work. Now, if he's strung up on the cross, either his hands are tied or nailed there, and he can't move his arms, he's going to have increasing difficulty in breathing. And to nail his feet to the bottom of the cross means that he can't even push himself up very well. So sooner or later, he's going to run out of oxygen. And that's when he starts to die. This is how people on the cross die. It's a very slow process. All gym junkies know that if you run out of breath, you just stop for a bit and you recover, and that's fine. Well, if you don't recover and you keep going, you'll get exhausted, and then you'll drop off, and then you'll be better. On the cross, you don't have such luxuries. So slowly, hour by hour, he gets less and less oxygen than he actually needs. And this can happen over a couple of days. The normal time to death on a cross is about 2 or 3 days. It's meant to be a long torture. In Jesus' case, he was already gone. I'll read from John 19 about the breaking the legs. In John 19, verse 32, the soldiers therefore came and broke the legs of the first man who had been crucified with Jesus, and then with the other. But when they came to Jesus and found he was already dead, they did not break his legs, because they didn't need to. If you're hung up like this and can't breathe and you smash your legs, what happens next? What happens? You can't push yourself up, your body drops even more, and there's even more collapse of your lungs. That's why they die quickly when their legs are broken. But Jesus was already dead. And I think it's important to know that Jesus was not killed. He chose to die. He chose to die. We know this because it says he cried out with a loud voice. Someone who does not have enough air in his lungs is not going to cry out with a loud voice. This is Jesus in total control of his fate, of his death, and of his destiny. And the words that he cried out, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit," is a cry of hope and trust. He knows there's something more beyond death. He knows there's something yet to come, something good and glorious. He knows. Now this is a painting of Joseph of Arimathea. We read about him in the second part of our reading. Verse 50 says, "Now there was a man named Joseph, a member of the council." This is the Jewish ruling council, the Sanhedrin. And they make all the major important decisions in Judea. He was a good and upright man, which is a special thing for Luke to say. You know, Luke only calls God good. In the other half a dozen references where Luke says somebody's good, it's either God the Father or Jesus, or I think he makes one reference to a servant in a parable. He's good, the good and faithful servant. Joseph is the only other person in the whole gospel that is called good by Luke. And he's good because he's a righteous person. He's an upright person. It means his relationship with God was right. He opposed this unjust court of the Sanhedrin. He opposed the deal they did with Judas. He was against this false conviction by a corrupt court. He was against sending Jesus to Pilate. He opposed all their actions and all their deeds. Instead, Joseph himself goes to Pilate, which is a show of great courage. I mean, this is a man executed by the Roman government. He's a criminal that is probably classed with terrorists. I don't know how many of us would like to be friends with terrorists. I mean, if you found that your neighbour was a terrorist, you'd probably move away. Would you go to lunch with a terrorist? Not deliberately, I think. These are dangerous people. And to ask for the body of an executed terrorist meant that I'm his friend. I'm automatically placing myself under suspicion in the face of the governor. So he goes there in a show of great courage. In John 19 it says that Joseph was a secret disciple. He was a follower of Jesus, but he didn't tell anyone because he was afraid of the Jews. And it seems very likely that after the death of Jesus, he is saying, I may be too late to declare my allegiance, but I'm going to do something now. I don't care who knows. He might be executed as a criminal. I might place myself under suspicion, but I'm going to do the right thing. It's very much like a parable that Jesus talked about in Matthew 21, where a father told two sons to go and do something. One said, I will, but he didn't. And the other one said, I won't, but he did. And Joseph was that second son who did the father's will. So he goes to Pilate and he makes preparations for the burial. Now, this is part of a rock tomb from Petra. And what you see is actually quite large. Well, everything in Petra is big. So we've got these crevices in here and these spaces underneath here. And the basic designs of a Middle Eastern rock tomb from the 1st century are there. You've got a shelf where the body is laid out, and it'll be wrapped up, and there'll be spices there, and the body will decompose over a few months. And when all the flesh is gone, they will put it in a stone box and underneath here, a stone box called an ossuary, and that's where they keep it. And then all these other spaces are for other people who are who have died and waiting for their interment. Not all Middle Eastern rock graves are this grand. Some of them are a bit like this. This is one person digging out a tomb. This is an excavation around Jerusalem. But the basic design is the same. We've got a slab, a shelf, or a niche where the body is laid to decompose. We've got ossuaries down here, little boxes containing their bones. as a memorial for them for future generations. Now, the point about what's happening to Jesus is that Joseph would wrap him up with all these spices in a linen cloth. Best cloth he could get. Fine linen is the literal word. And John says that Nicodemus helped him out. And between the two of them and probably a couple of servants, they wrapped him up in 34 kilos of spices. Now that's a lot of spices. Normally you wouldn't do that. A few handfuls of spices, maybe a couple of kilos of spices. 34 kilos of spices is normally reserved for kings, royalty, somebody extremely important. Joseph and Nicodemus were making a point here. We think that this man is the king. We should give him a king's burial. So 34 kilos of spices. The spices are not meant to preserve the body. The spices are, it's like perfume, because you're going to have this one here. You might have a few months later somebody else will die. You'll be over here. People will be going in and out of this tomb several times a year. It's just to cover up the smell of rotting flesh. Yes, they have strange customs. They probably think we have strange customs, just sealing somebody in a wooden box and throwing dirt over him. It says that when Joseph had asked for the body, he put it in a tomb cut in the rock in which no one had yet been laid. And most people think that's just so generous of him. I mean, he's got his own family mausoleum. It's not been used yet. He offers it to Jesus. It is also very important as another kind of witness, because you see here a used tomb. They could have lots of bodies in there, and lots of bodies waiting to be embalmed, lying on the shelves, waiting to decompose. The fact that the tomb had never been used, Jesus was the first one, meant that on the following day, when the women went back, they couldn't make a mistake. It wouldn't be, is it this body or that body or this body or another body around the corner? There was only one body. It had never been used before. In verse 55, it says, the women who had come with Jesus followed Joseph and saw the tomb and how the body was laid, and they went home and prepared more spices and perfumes, but they rested on the Sabbath. So they had more work to do. They expected to finish off the embalming and wrapping process and the perfuming process, but they were also righteous, God-fearing women. They wouldn't keep doing this just because it was a Sabbath. They had to do whatever they could and then go away and prepare some more, but spend the Sabbath at rest as the commandment said so. So Jesus in his death is surrounded by good people, righteous people, people who expected him to be in the tomb 2 days later. They didn't expect him to burst out and not be there. After all, they just spent a large fortune in perfumes. They just spent a large legacy in family tombs. They just done all this sort of stuff, expecting that a few days later they could come back. Jesus is still there. So what's Luke telling us? Have we worked it out? What is Luke telling us about Jesus? Well, a few things, I think. First is that Jesus is innocent. So many people said he's innocent. Right? The executioner said he's innocent. Everybody knew it was a set-up job. Second, he's righteous. Surrounded by righteous people. He's surrounded by disciples who, although they might have lost their courage in the heat of battle, came back later. It's telling us that Jesus is really dead. Everybody expected him to be dead. No one there was saying, oh wait, you didn't do it properly. Let's do that again. They all thought he was dead for good reason. He was. And if I stop right there, you think, he hasn't finished the story. Well, you're right, I haven't. Because there's another bit coming up next week. But this is a good place to finish the story now, because this is what we remember when we come to this table. Paul says, I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way after supper he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes."